Jeremiah here. I'm with Jamie Shaw of the Canadian Association of Medical Cannabis Dispensaries, also known as CAMCD, which is a union of now illegal medical marijuana dispensaries in Canada. Jamie, good to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, Jamie, I wanted to ask you about this latest press release put out by CAMCD. And as I said, you guys represent medical cannabis dispensaries that are, at the moment, kind of in a gray area. And we now
Very
have,
much so.
yeah, we now have news items showing liquor stores in several provinces. At least the people who represent liquor stores, that's the union here in British Columbia that represents the government liquor store employees, and the private liquor stores altogether have been asking the government for permission to sell marijuana. Now, you guys have made a comment about that. Can you tell us what you think about liquor stores selling marijuana?
Well, I mean, it's an odd choice. There's no other jurisdiction in the world has done that. Even Washington State, that put it under the Liquor Control Board, still actually they changed the name of it to the Liquor and Cannabis Control Board, and they never tried to put cannabis in liquor stores. There's some issues with that for sure, that aren't necessarily doesn't necessarily negate that it could be underneath the Liquor Control Board, but selling it in liquor stores is what we would have a bit of a problem with, particularly if it's only where it was sold.
And so, Jamie, what is it that's wrong with selling marijuana in a liquor store?
Well, there's a bunch of different things. I mean, one, our public health policies around alcohol have not been super successful. Cannabis is not the same substance as alcohol, but we do know that when the two substances are mixed together, the effects can be a little harder to predict than either one on its own. There are also a lot of people that are using cannabis to get off of things like alcohol. So putting it in a consumption-oriented environment like that may not be the best option.
Right. Now, the liquor store people are saying they're the best ones to do this because they know how to check IDs better than anybody else. Is that something that they have an advantage over anybody else on?
I don't think that that's actually ever been proven. I mean, I know I was underage in Canada at one point and never had any problems getting alcohol, ever. So I'm not sure, how they exactly make that claim. Corner stores are checking for IDs all the time in terms of cigarettes. And, dispensaries obviously check IDs as well. So we actually usually issue our own ID cards based on their paperwork and their IDs. So it's an odd argument for them to be making.
Now, maybe just before we go too much further on that side, you could tell us a little bit about what CAMCD actually is.
Absolutely. We were formed in 2011, and it was basically a way for dispensaries to pool resources. I mean, we've been around for a long time, and we were all sort of working on our own, pushing our own agendas and duplicating a lot of the same work. So what CAMCD did is we sat down, we figured out some standards, some industry best practices that we could all agree to, and then developed the certification program with UBC and the SEED program. And then recently we just launched the trade membership program, which requires compliance to 18 of those standards. So we can be sure that all of the dispensaries that are in CAMCD are working towards the same goals with the same ideals in mind.
Now, as I said in the beginning of the show, you guys represent the dispensaries that aren't actually legal yet. In Canada, we have a strange situation where we have federal laws that would basically ban the dispensaries completely and put these people in prison, but we have licensed producers allowed by the government to send pot through the mail. But those aren't the ones that you guys deal with.
In terms of licensed producers?
Yeah, the LPs.
Yeah, no, licensed producers deal directly with customers. We also still have a large MMAR market where people are still licensed to be growing cannabis and providing for others, and that's still not been sorted out. We're waiting for the large trial to see how that goes. So, I mean, currently in Canada, there's 3 medical systems that are all competing with the black market, basically, at this point.
And now the LPs, is it possible for an LP to get certification from CAMCD?
We did look into that. Part of the issues, I mean, because there are mail-out only dispensaries, but part of the issues have to do around community. We have requirements around dispensaries are required to give back to their communities. They're required to give back to their patients. Those types of things don't really fit into the LP system. So, I mean, we wouldn't be totally opposed to a licensed producer if they wanted to apply as a mail-out dispensary, but there might be some issues in terms of, like, if they don't have an office where patients can come in and visit, for example, that would disqualify them as well. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, we know that in Canada, of the type of dispensaries that aren't in the legal status right now, there's lots. I mean, we're looking at probably 200 or more of these things now.
Yeah, I would say close to 300 now. Yeah.
And that's not just in big cities either, like Vancouver and Toronto, where there's, over 120 in Vancouver, something like close to 40 in Toronto, but other smaller places as well across the country.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's probably more than 40 in Toronto by now. The numbers have been growing drastically out there. But yes, I mean, you're looking at Nanaimo that's got about 10 dispensaries in the area, and Kelowna and Vernon that have about 10 dispensaries in the area, and Port Alberni, I believe, only has one, but there's a couple more up in that area as well. There's dispensaries in Saskatchewan and Alberta. So yeah, it's definitely a nationwide thing.
Mm-hmm. And now, of these groups, at the moment we're seeing a bunch of them being targeted by local police forces in some of the smaller places like Nanaimo, where 16 people were arrested at 3 different dispensaries. So we still have this, back and forth between local police forces and the feds, who have basically said all marijuana will be legalized at some point. Is that, I mean, have you heard about the distress that this is causing to some of the people in the dispensaries?
Oh, of course, particularly to members. I mean, every time an action like this happens, patients start getting stressed out about whether they're going to be able to still get their medicine or not. So this is, it's definitely a big issue for not only dispensaries, but for their members. And it's hard to say right now what's going on, like whether these were investigations that were started under the Harper government. We do know that in Nanaimo, for example, those dispensaries reopened and the city is now looking at regulating them. So it looks like they've moved past that enforcement, like they finished off their investigations and now they're actually going to do something that hopefully will address the situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, that'd be great, because they were making threats earlier that the raids will continue and all of these things. So, yeah, I'd be glad to see it end. Now, Jamie, I just wanted to ask you again about the liquor stores and their plan. We have the BC liquor store plan. We have the Ontario one that they're pushing forward. Now, the BC plan, the thing that, I have a problem with is not necessarily that they'll be selling it in a liquor store, which I don't think is the best place for it. I kind of have more the idea that everybody should be allowed to sell it no matter where they are. But the thing that bothers me about the BC liquor store agreement is there's a moratorium on any new liquor stores until 2020. So it's the way it seems would be, not only would it be a bad place to sell it, but it would also be giving these people a monopoly.
Yes, yeah. Well, and there'd be a lot of issues still to work out around that. Like, would they, with the moratorium on liquor stores, would that count towards, like, say, private liquor stores that weren't actually going to be selling liquor? Because one of the things that we've heard around their plan was that you could apply for a liquor store license and then just not sell liquor and only sell cannabis, which seems a little odd. And clearly there would need to be some sort of separate program worked out for that with separate standards. I mean, cannabis is not alcohol. It doesn't have the same storage and handling requirements. And obviously the usage information is going to be quite different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really, like we were saying before, it seems like an odd place that, these private liquor stores where when I go in there, they don't even know anything about beer or wine, really. They know a very small amount. So are these, my question is, are these really the people that should be handling cannabis, which there's a lot of information you need to know about pot?
There is, yeah. I mean, that's, I think public education campaigns are going to be a big part of this. I mean, we've seen that in Colorado and Washington and California as well, where they've really done a lot of work educating the public on cannabis. And even that needs to be worked out. At one point, they were looking at banning pregnant women from dispensaries in Colorado. Luckily, they looked at the evidence and went, well, that makes no sense. And so they didn't move forward with that. So, I mean, ideally, what we're hoping for out of legalization is that that people will actually start studying this plant without bias and learning about this plant without bias. And once that happens, I think we're really going to start seeing the stigma erode pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Now, you guys released a press release a few days ago, December 16th, with the headline, Dispensary Association agrees with public service unions, no need to reinvent the wheel. And then the subhead is, makes sense to use existing system for cannabis distribution. Now, when I first read that, I was a little confused because I thought you guys were supporting the public service unions because it was saying you agree with them. But in the details, of course, that's not what you guys were saying.
Well, I mean, we agreed with their principle that there is no need to reinvent the wheel, and we absolutely believe that's true. And dispensaries are the preferred model in most jurisdictions in North America. Actually, very few that have any kind of legal well, actually none that have recreational, but only a few of the medical legal jurisdictions don't have dispensaries in them. So, to us, that makes the most sense. It doesn't make sense to say, oh, it makes sense for us to do it because we sell alcohol, when it's actually a totally different substance with totally different requirements. So I think there was some agreement there. We've also been a little confused because, I mean, Rona Ambrose came out with a statement that we sort of half agreed with, and that's like the first time that's ever happened. We didn't agree with her reasonings why, but we did agree that it shouldn't be sold in liquor stores. So,
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a difference, obviously, and this is something that in Colorado and Washington, the activists have been trying to pay attention to, and that's the difference between a medical cannabis dispensary and a recreational cannabis dispensary. CAMCD is the Canadian Association of Medical Cannabis Dispensaries. How are you guys adapting to this new environment of recreational dispensaries?
Well, it's an interesting one because, in Colorado, for example, the medical dispensaries were the recreational dispensaries. The first ones required you to be an operating medical dispensary before you could sell recreational cannabis. That makes sense to us, but there's still... This was never about an into recreational cannabis for us. Medical cannabis is its own thing, and the patients have their own needs and their own requirements. And so for us, our mission is still medical cannabis, but obviously a lot of our standards, if you remove some of the medical documentation requirements, it's pretty much the exact same standards that you would require for recreational. So obviously we're willing to work with whatever group or body gets to govern this and gets to figure this out. But for us, dispensaries are the ones that make the most sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are the most important differences between medical and recreational, and what you'd need to, what is it that you'd need to actually pay attention to, bigger picture, about the differences there?
Well, I mean, there's some kind of more tangential points about that, including like, would we have CBD strains if it was a purely recreational market? So there's things in terms of the strains and the cannabinoid profiles. But just beyond that, if you are using cannabis therapeutically, for example, you don't really care what benefits you're getting. It's not really that important. You're getting some, great. Doesn't really matter what. If you're a medical patient that's seeking relief from specific symptoms or something like that, it's really important for you to understand the difference between the strains and which ones are going to be more effective than others. And of course, dispensaries have been dealing with patients for a long, long time. We've been able to collect that information and share it amongst our members. So it's been a really useful resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, it's about having information about the strains and really knowing what's best for what, and that's... Yeah. I'm impressed when I go into the medical cannabis dispensaries here in Vancouver with how knowledgeable the staff there really are. They know the product. A lot of them have been doing this for many years, and they really care about the product as well. And because these people have been willing to put their asses on the line to go there and do this stuff.
That's exactly right.
I'm thinking that, when they open it up to everybody, it's going to be harder to find. Maybe you'll have to go to a specialty store. The way I see the wine model now is similar to that, though, where you have the liquor stores that sell all the big name brands and mass-produced stuff, but you also have the wine connoisseur market. Is that something that you think would fit into that model? I mean, is that enough, though?
No, I don't believe it is. I mean, I think you'll see that just on the recreational side, right? Like, I think you will see dispensaries that are a little bit more like McDonald's, for example, and then you will see more high-end connoisseur type dispensaries. So that's still both on the recreational side, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now, will CAMCD be opening up to recreational dispensaries in some way, or allowing for that end? What are you guys going to do?
It's We're still trying to figure that out. We're talking about how to do that in the best way. For us, the big thing is, one of the benefits of CAMCD was for patients, because they can see the CAMCD decal on the door, and they know that that dispensary has strict practices. It's going to protect their information, and they're going to have some medical knowledge. So anything that we do to open up to recreational dispensaries, it's going to be really important that patients can tell the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really the main part, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and because that's what it's all about, is being a resource for these patients. And Jamie, is there a place where people can, get information? I guess online is the best place to get information about CAMCD.
Yeah, www.camcd.ca.
Mm-hmm. But where do you guys have your dispensaries? Who is it that's part of the CAMCD system?
That also is up on the website, and we have a couple Toronto dispensaries, Saskatchewan dispensary, and BC ones. The number's been growing pretty drastically over the course of the last few months, so I can't actually give you an exact number. But right now, I think what we focused on getting Vancouver ones through, because they had to have the letter of acceptance before their application dates. So the numbers in Vancouver right now are a little high, but we'll be looking at doing Victoria very shortly, because their regulations are going to be coming down the pike as well. So.
Mm-hmm. And now, of course, in Vancouver, yesterday we had Trudeau meeting up with the mayor here, talking about marijuana and what's changing. Now, and in Vancouver, of course, we have this new city council system where they've now announced, I think, 8 dispensaries that will be allowed to remain open.
8 that have moved through to the next step. Yeah.
To the next step, yeah. They're giving the other ones 6 months to come up with a new location, things like that. How do you see the future of Vancouver's medical cannabis dispensaries? I mean, is there going to be a war with enforcement? Are people going to stand up against this? What's going to happen here?
I don't know. It's going to be interesting. I mean, the city's been fairly, willing to work with dispensaries to try and find new locations, to try and, they've granted a couple of extensions at different points for people that were having trouble getting the filing in at times. So, I mean, our impression is that they really do want to work with dispensaries to get as many through as possible. What that actually is going to look like is almost impossible to say at this point. I mean, we don't know the results of the declustering. We don't know how many people are going to get variance acceptances. So it's a lot of questions about that right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, in their own comments on the subject, they've said that they don't think by the end of it more than 10-something% is going to actually make it through, and that was a few months ago now. But I mean, we have 120 dispensaries or more in the city, and the declustering is going to remove a heck of a lot of them. It seems like there's going to be a lot of unhappy customers and dispensary owners.
Yeah, it's a possibility. I mean, the one of the benefits, I guess, of the distance requirement that we actually think is probably not necessary, but one of the benefits of it is that it will sort of ensure that there's decent coverage in the city. So everybody should have a dispensary fairly close to them. Whether it's going to be the one that they prefer or not is another question. And how many options they have in their area also will still be up to question. But that is one of the things that is San Francisco did the opposite. When they first launched, they said everybody had to be in this one area, and then of course every business in that area was a dispensary, and people were complaining about having to travel all across the city, and so they ended up coming up with this distance requirement thing that's very similar to what Vancouver's using. So, I mean, we're hoping we can see some give back on that, because we think the 300 meters from dispensaries and schools and community centers, there's a lot of issues with each of those 3 points.
Well, just in the end,
that we can get amended.
It just doesn't provide for enough of them with the market we have now. I mean, whether or not, because of the distance requirements, it forces a lot of them to close, doesn't it?
Yes, it is going to do that, and this is also where some of the numbers start to get weird, because the city originally said that the distancing requirements would allow between like 80 and 90 in the city. So then when they started saying 20 later, we weren't really sure what that was based on or where that was coming from. So I mean, there's still questions there, because according to their estimates, should be allowed to be about 90, but looking at what's going on in the licensing process, it doesn't look like there's going to be that many.
So maybe some discrepancy between what's available and what they're actually allowing through.
Yes, yeah, and when we've seen rent speculation, we've seen people like get leases on things in areas that they know are going to be safe areas, and then try and repurpose those leases and sell them to people that want dispensaries, and so there's been some real estate speculation going on as well.
Now, what about dispensaries who choose to stand up against the government regulations? Does CAMCD support that?
It would depend on the issue, right? I mean, we've always been asking for regulations. I think we've always kind of known that when we got them, we weren't really going to like everything about them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it really would depend on the individual situation and why they're choosing to stand up for it.
Mm-hmm. Now, I haven't really dipped into the liquor store plan for Ontario, but I'm assuming it's similar to the BC one. And in fact, I think that the press release, was that just in response to the Ontario one, or did that cover the BC one?
It was mostly a response, but I mean, it was sort of, it came up in Manitoba as well. So right. I think it was just overall a response to the whole thing. But yeah, I believe one of the main differences was here in BC, they were talking about in private liquor stores, even though it was also the public union, so it sounds like it would be both public and private.
Mm-hmm.
And I could be wrong about this, but I kind of had gotten the impression that Ontario was just their public ones. So
right.
I'll have to look into that a little bit more.
Well, Jamie, I really appreciate having you on, and thanks for all the info. We'll definitely check in with you to see what's happening as this moves forward. But man, what an exciting time.
Oh, absolutely. Interesting times.